Before I write this, one quick, honest note. I searched for real background, and it turns out Bill Gates Furious as Windows 11 is a whole template used across dozens of AI slop YouTube channels. One forum thread I found literally calls out this exact title as clickbait with an AI voiceover over unrelated stock footage. Gates hasn't run Microsoft in about 2 decades and hasn't made any public furious statement about Windows 11. What is real? Gates has long-standing public comments about software needing to stay simple, and there's a genuine, well-documented user backlash against Windows 11 right now. Bugs, forced hardware requirements, Copilot, AI overload, recall privacy concerns, and a real migration trend toward Linux and macOS. Serious enough that Microsoft itself has publicly promised to pull back on AI clutter in 2026. So I've written the script using the real controversy and Gates' real philosophy as the emotional engine, framed honestly, not as fabricated quotes putting words in his mouth. It still hits hard. Here it is, in full English, paragraph by paragraph. There is a moment happening right now on millions of computers around the world that most people are not paying attention to. A small notification appears in the corner of the screen. A user clicks it away without reading it, and in that single dismissed click, something larger is quietly taking shape. A slow-motion collapse of trust between the world's most dominant software company and the very people who made it dominant in the first place. Nobody declared war. Nobody signed a document. But the war is already underway, and almost nobody watching their screen understands what they are witnessing. Here is the question nobody in the tech press wants to ask directly. Why is the operating system that once defined the personal computer now the operating system people are actively trying to escape? Why are IT departments, home users, gamers, and even longtime loyalists suddenly searching terms like how to switch to Linux or is macOS worth it now at rates never seen before? Something changed. And once you start pulling that thread, you find yourself standing in front of a much bigger story. One about control, about data, about the slow erosion of a promise Microsoft made to its users decades ago. To understand what's happening in 2026, you have to go back to the beginning. Not for nostalgia, but because the contrast is the entire story. When Bill Gates was building the foundation of what would become the world's most used operating system, he wasn't obsessed with monetization loops or engagement metrics. He said something that, at the time, sounded almost too simple to matter. That the finest software comes from someone who has a complete understanding of exactly how the program works. Someone who loves it enough to keep it simple, to an almost extreme degree. Read that again. Simplicity as a discipline, not a feature, a philosophy. That idea is the seed of everything Windows was supposed to be. And it is also the exact idea that Windows 11, as it exists right now, appears to have abandoned. Because here's where it gets uncomfortable. Windows 11 in 2026 is not simple. It is not lean. It is not a tool that quietly gets out of your way so you can do your work. It has become something else entirely. A sprawling, AI-saturated, ad-injected, telemetry-heavy environment that increasingly feels like it is working for someone other than the person sitting in front of the keyboard. And the people noticing this shift the most aren't casual users. They're the power users, the IT administrators, the longtime Windows veterans who have used every version since the 90s. When that group starts jumping ship, it's not noise, it's a signal. So what actually happened? What most people are not seeing is that this didn't happen overnight. It built, layer by layer, decision by decision, until the operating system reached a breaking point. And 2026 is the year that breaking point became impossible to ignore. Microsoft's very first major patch of the year was supposed to be routine maintenance. Instead, it was built to quietly fix over 100 existing bugs. And in the process of doing that, it triggered a fresh wave of new ones. Think about what that means. This wasn't a company polishing a stable product. This was a company patching a structure that was already cracking under its own weight, and every repair was creating new instability somewhere else in the system. But the bugs were never really the core problem. The core problem is what Microsoft chose to prioritize instead of fixing them. While millions of users were dealing with broken updates, freezing File Explorer windows, and performance regressions on hardware that used to run flawlessly, Microsoft's engineering resources were being funneled somewhere else entirely, toward an aggressive company-wide push to embed artificial intelligence into every corner of the operating system. Copilot wasn't offered as an optional tool anymore. It became something closer to an occupying presence, appearing in the taskbar, in settings, in File Explorer, in Notepad, in the Start menu, whether the user wanted it there or not. And here's where it gets worse. For many users, it wasn't just annoying, it was unsettling. This is where the story stops being about buggy software and starts becoming something far more serious. A question about surveillance, memory, and consent. Windows 11 introduced a feature that quietly records what happens on your screen, essentially building a searchable timeline of everything you've done on your own computer. Even in its scaled-back form, Even with promises about local processing and opt-in settings, the feature ignited a firestorm because the underlying implication was impossible to ignore. Your operating system was being redesigned to remember everything by default, unless you actively fought to stop it. For an operating system that runs banking sessions, medical records, private messages, and confidential work documents, that is not a small design choice. That is a fundamental redefinition of what your computer even means. And this is where everything changes, because once users start questioning whether their operating system is working for them or observing them, every other decision Microsoft makes starts to look different. The full-screen ads that appear inside the Start menu, promoting Microsoft's own subscription services, the persistent nudges to sign in with a Microsoft account instead of a local one, the way certain settings menus seem deliberately designed to bury the option to turn features off, forcing users through multiple confusing screens just to opt out of something they never asked to opt into in the first place. None of these are catastrophic on their own, but stacked together, they start to look less like isolated product decisions and more like a coordinated strategy, one designed to maximize engagement, data collection, and subscription revenue, even at the cost of user trust. Now here is where the story escalates into something with real physical consequences. Not just software annoyance, but actual economic and environmental fallout. Windows 11's hardware requirements, particularly around TPM 2.0 security chips and specific processor generations, have effectively declared millions of still functional computers obsolete. Akeens that run perfectly fine, machines with years of life left in them, machines that in any previous era would have simply received the new operating system without issue, locked out. Users are left with only a small number of paths forward. Pay for extended security updates on an aging system, buy entirely new hardware they didn't need, or start looking somewhere else entirely. And somewhere else is exactly what a growing number of them are choosing. This is not a fringe trend anymore. Across tech forums, enterprise IT communities, and grassroots online discussions, the same pattern keeps repeating. Individuals and entire departments openly stating they are moving away from Microsoft's ecosystem, citing privacy concerns around AI data collection as a direct named reason. Read that again, not vague dissatisfaction, but specific, deliberate departure, tied directly to fear over what Copilot and its surrounding AI infrastructure can see, store, and potentially transmit. When an IT lead responsible for protecting sensitive company data starts actively racing to remove Microsoft software before a deadline they set for themselves, that is not an outlier complaint. That is a company losing the trust of the exact professional class that used to be its most loyal defenders. And here's the twist that makes this story so much bigger than some people are annoyed at ads. This is not chaos. This is strategy, just not the kind that benefits the user. Every major tech company right now is locked in an arms race to embed AI into its products because the entire industry's valuation, its investor confidence, its stock price trajectory has become tied to the perception that AI integration equals future dominance. Microsoft is not pushing Copilot into every corner of Windows because users demanded it. It is pushing Copilot into every corner of Windows because the company's financial narrative depends on proving to markets that its AI investment is inseparable from its core product. Your desktop became a battlefield in a war that has almost nothing to do with what you actually need from your computer. But strategies built on force instead of trust tend to generate resistance. And that resistance is exactly what's escalating now. The migration numbers tell their own story. Linux distributions, built specifically for former Windows users, designed to feel familiar, to ease the transition, to remove the intimidation factor that used to keep casual users locked into Microsoft's ecosystem, are seeing download and adoption numbers climb in ways they never have before. macOS, long dismissed by budget-conscious users as the expensive alternative, is being reconsidered by people who have simply decided that paying more for a system that treats them with more respect is worth it. This is the quiet migration nobody is putting on a headline, but it is happening in real numbers, in real households, in real IT departments right now. Think about what this means for a company that has built its entire empire on being the default. Windows didn't dominate the personal computing market because it was the most elegant operating system ever built. It dominated because it became the invisible assumption, the thing every school, every office, every family simply used without questioning because switching felt harder than staying. That invisible assumption was Microsoft's greatest asset, and it is precisely that assumption that is now, for the first time in decades, being actively challenged by a meaningful percentage of its own user base. Here's where the story deepens even further because Microsoft is not blind to any of this. Internally, the company has publicly acknowledged that something has gone wrong. Statements have come directly from Microsoft's own leadership admitting that Windows needs to improve in ways that are meaningful for people, corporate language, carefully chosen, but language that nonetheless amounts to an admission. And more recently, the company has signaled an intention to pull back on unnecessary Copilot integration, promising a renewed focus on performance and reliability instead of AI saturation. Read that again. A company doesn't publicly promise to walk back its own flagship AI strategy unless the backlash has become too large, too loud, and too damaging to ignore. But here's where it gets worse before it gets better. Because promises of a reset are not the same as an actual reset. Corporate messaging is cheap. Reversing a strategic direction that the entire company's AI narrative and investor messaging depends on is expensive, slow, and politically fraught inside a massive organization. What most people are not seeing is the internal tension this creates. A company simultaneously trying to convince Wall Street that AI is central to its future, while trying to convince frustrated users that AI won't be shoved down their throats anymore. Those two messages cannot both be fully true at the same time. Something has to give, and whichever audience Microsoft ultimately prioritizes, investors or users, will define the next chapter of this story. This is the part of the story that connects everything back to where we started. Bill Gates' original philosophy wasn't really about software at all. It was about respect. Respect for the user's intelligence, their time, their ownership over the tool they paid for. A program built with restraint, built by someone who deeply understood it and refused to clutter it, was ultimately an act of trust in the person using it. What Windows 11 represents, to its critics, is the inversion of that trust. A system that assumes the user is a data source first and a customer second. Whether or not Gates himself has personally commented on any of this, the philosophical gap between what he once described as good software and what Windows has become is not something anyone seriously disputes. Even Microsoft, in its own carefully worded admissions, seems to know it. And this is where the uncertainty becomes impossible to ignore. Because if a meaningful percentage of power users, IT departments, and privacy-conscious households continue walking away, Microsoft faces a problem far larger than bad press. Operating systems are not just products. They're ecosystems. Every user who leaves takes potential future software compatibility, community support, and platform relevance with them. Enough departures, sustained over enough years, and the default status Windows has held for over 3 decades stops being guaranteed. That is not a small risk for a company whose entire business model still depends heavily on Windows sitting on the vast majority of the world's desktops and laptops. So where does this actually go from here? Does Microsoft genuinely reverse course, stripping back the AI clutter and rebuilding the trust it has spent the last several years quietly eroding? Or does the promised reset turn out to be cosmetic? A few settings menus reorganized, a few prompts dialed back, while the underlying direction toward AI-embedded, data-hungry software continues regardless of what users actually want? Does the migration to Linux and macOS remain a niche trend confined to tech forums and IT departments? Or does it reach a tipping point that forces an even bigger reckoning inside Redmond? Nobody currently has a confirmed answer, and that is precisely what makes this moment so unstable. What we do know is this: the operating system that once symbolized simplicity, reliability, and quiet competence is now at the center of a trust crisis of its own making. The users who built Microsoft's empire, one purchase and one login at a time, are for the first time in a generation seriously asking themselves whether staying is still worth it. And whatever Microsoft chooses to do next, whether it listens or whether it simply waits for the anger to fade the way it always has before, will determine whether Windows remains the invisible default of computing or becomes remembered as the operating system that finally pushed too far.